Hi, welcome back to the Match Flute channel. It has been a while, but today I am here with a video talking through some of my favorite orchestral excerpt books that I think will be very useful to have in a classical flautist's collection. Let's get started. Some of these books that I'm about to talk about I find are quite useful in my collection, and depending on where you study as a flute player, some teachers will actually like you to memorize those excerpts, so it's good to get started early. Some of these orchestral excerpt books I use on a daily basis. It's important for an aspiring flute player who wants to become a professional flautist to know about these excerpts and to start learning them, because some of these excerpts are often the pieces that are most requested in audition settings. Because these excerpts are highly technically demanding, it's not recommended that you start learning the notes right before an audition. The idea is that you build up a library of orchestral excerpts that you know, so that when you're called upon to present it, you can prepare it very quickly in a very short amount of time. Doing an audition isn't just about knowing the notes, it also is about your musicality, your rhythm, your phrasing, your tone colors, and so learning the notes in advance for these excerpts will give yourself a little bit more time to explore some of these other elements of these excerpts. The last thing you want when you're preparing for an audition is to be stressing about learning the notes. The panel will also usually look for very specific things, so it's definitely not just enough to impress them with only the correct notes and rhythms. For instance, knowing the context of the orchestral excerpt is also very important. Knowing who you're playing with in the ensemble, and knowing how the orchestra usually responds to this flute solo is also something you need to think about when you're preparing for an orchestral audition. Dynamic contrast, rhythmic accuracy, and stylistic accuracy is also really important, so making sure that you listen to an excerpt before you start learning it, because it's very obvious if you get into an audition and you play the excerpt and you don't actually know how it's supposed to go. That basically tells the panel that you haven't done your research and you haven't bothered to learn the context around this excerpt. Also phrasing, figuring out places where you want to breathe and building up your endurance for some really, really long notes. In general, if you've pretty much decided that you enjoy orchestral playing and you want to do more of it in the future, it's a good idea to start learning some of these most commonly asked excerpts, because they are designed to test your musician skills, your rhythmic skills, your technical proficiency, as well as your ensemble skills. The list of commonly asked excerpts is also another topic that I think I'll save for another video some other day. So the books that I'll be talking about today do contain some of the most commonly asked excerpts, as well as a few really, really important ones that you might want to start to nail down during your studies. Personally, the excerpt book that I used the most during my uni degree studying the classical flute was the Orchestra Probespiel for flute and piccolo. This is actually a book that I would recommend for those of you who aren't super familiar with orchestral excerpts yet but are just starting to get into it. This book has a collection of 70 excerpts for flute and piccolo that were compiled by 2 German editors. The excerpts in this book contain a lot of well-known pieces, so some short flute excerpts from Beethoven symphonies, Midsummer Night's Dream by Mendelssohn, as well as Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe. The only thing I'd say about this book is that the excerpts are quite short, and so they don't contain many of the other passages that might occasionally get asked in an audition. Plus, it also introduces you to some orchestral piccolo excerpts that you will definitely need to know how to play in orchestra. Once you've had a chance to get to know some orchestral excerpts, the next book that I recommend is Jeannie Baxtress's Orchestral Excerpts for Flute and Piano. Book 1. Book 1 contains a list of the excerpts that are most traditionally asked in auditions, as well as a couple of modern excerpts that are a little bit more obscure and difficult to find. This is why this book has been very useful for me as well, because it's combined pretty much all the sort of significant flute solos in one place. Unlike solo repertoire, it is typically quite difficult to get a hold of orchestral flute parts that aren't out of copyright yet, because those orchestral parts are quite expensive to purchase or hire. Jeannie Baxtress also published a second book following book 1. And book 2 basically contains a list of the most commonly asked ballet and opera orchestras, as well as some excerpts from modern film music. The thing that's so great about both these books is that they come with the reduced piano part, so you can actually get a feel of what it would be like to play these excerpts in context without having to wait to play them in an orchestra. If you've got a buddy who's also aspiring to become an orchestral flute player, then you can have a look at the Great Flute Duos book, also by Jeannie Baxtress. This book is basically a selection of some of the most significant flute section passages within the orchestral repertoire. It is particularly useful for you to get together with another flute player to play through these parts so that you are ready in case you ever need to play them in orchestra. If you learn all the excerpts in the books that I've talked about so far, you're pretty much set for your flute mock auditions or your orchestral excerpts exam in uni. These next few books that I'll talk about are a little bit more in depth and contain some orchestral excerpts that aren't commonly asked but would be good to know. The Flute audition has an extensive list of orchestral excerpts that aren't usually requested at auditions, but are definitely pieces that get programmed and performed by orchestras in Europe. Excerpt books that contain certain pieces from the entirety of certain pieces include the 4 Wilfred Smith Orchestral Excerpts book and John Woomer's 9 books of orchestral excerpts. Now, this is a huge collection of orchestral excerpt books, so you don't necessarily have to collect all of them, but they will be useful for you to know if you are aiming on becoming a professional orchestral flautist in the future. So those are some of the most helpful and useful orchestral books that I have come across in my studies as a classical flute player. I hope this video has helped you in some way. If you've made it all the way to the end, thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I will see you soon in the next video. Happy fluting!